When a massive chemical processing facility loses its primary safety systems engineer, the consequences extend far beyond mere administrative inconveniences or temporary operational hiccups. The stakes are profoundly different. When safety systems fail in this industry, people do not just lose their jobs, people lose their lives. Entire communities can be devastated. Environmental disasters can alter the landscape for generations. I knew that reality intimately. I had known it, breathed it, and lived it for 28 long, grueling, yet deeply fulfilling years. The new vice president of operations, a man named Bradley, apparently had not received that particular memo yet. Or if he had, he chose to ignore it in favor of his beloved financial spreadsheets and cost-cutting mandates. I was sitting in the cab of my heavy-duty pickup truck in the gravel parking lot of a local diner, a place famous for its greasy but incredible breakfast plates. I was eating a massive sausage and egg biscuit, savoring the harsh black coffee, and reading the morning shift incident reports from the chemical plant on my tablet. For most men my age, 58 years old, mornings might involve reading the sports section or the stock market summaries. For me, reading about pressure anomalies, thermal oxidizer fluctuations, and valve maintenance schedules was my daily ritual. It was 6:15 in the morning. The sky over the industrial corridor of the Gulf Coast was putting on that spectacular, almost toxic display it often does in late autumn, transitioning from a deep bruised purple to a violent orange, and finally to a pale, hazy pink in the span of about 15 minutes. It was the kind of sunrise that briefly made you forget that you were parked adjacent to a massive industrial complex that perpetually smelled faintly of sulfur and ozone. My phone vibrated against the console. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was my daughter, Emily, calling to remind me about her upcoming birthday dinner that Friday evening. I smiled. I had remembered. I assured her I would absolutely be there, mentioning that I had already picked up a gift. She laughed and said that was good, because her husband was planning an elaborate seafood feast, and she needed me there to help eat it. We chatted for a few more minutes before I hung up, put the truck in gear, and began the short drive to the facility. I had been the senior process safety systems engineer at Vanguard Chemical Corporation for 28 years. Before Vanguard, I had spent 7 years at a smaller, much older refinery down the coast, a place that had long since been decommissioned and dismantled. I understood industrial pressure vessels, multi-stage distillation columns, and volatile chemical reactions the way a seasoned surgeon understands the human cardiovascular system. I did not just see the metal in the pipes, I saw the history. I knew what lay beneath the insulation. I knew what the structural scars meant, what specific components had been patched, welded, or bypassed over the decades, and precisely why those decisions had been made. Most importantly, I knew exactly what catastrophic chain of events would unfold if someone, somewhere, pushed the wrong button, ignored the wrong warning light, or bypassed the wrong safety interlock at the wrong time. My department was lean, but highly specialized. It consisted of exactly 4 people, including myself. Together, we maintained the entire process safety management program for a sprawling facility that covered nearly 800 acres of storage tanks, processing towers, heat exchangers, subterranean pipelines, and a dizzying array of interconnected, highly volatile systems. If mismanaged, the energy contained within those 800 acres could easily level a medium-sized town. We were the invisible shield. We managed the rigorous inspection schedules, the voluminous federal compliance filings, the complex management of change documentation, the mandatory pre-startup safety reviews, and the continuous certifications for the emergency shutdown systems. None of those terms sound particularly dramatic to an outsider. They sound bureaucratic, tedious, and dry. But in my world, that bureaucracy was the thin line between a normal Tuesday and a headline-making disaster. Then came Bradley. The new vice president of operations arrived in late August. He was 41 years old, possessed a freshly minted Master of Business Administration degree from a prestigious, very expensive university on the East Coast, a fact he made sure to weave into almost every introductory conversation. He had spent the previous 8 years doing operational restructuring and efficiency consulting for companies that manufactured mundane consumer goods things, like cardboard boxes, office furniture, and plastic toys. He had absolutely zero background in heavy industry, let alone hazardous chemical processing. But he came in with a rigid, non-negotiable mandate from the executive board. Cut operational overhead by 15% before the end of the fourth quarter. The underlying reason for this aggressive cost-cutting was the worst-kept secret in the company. Vanguard Chemical's parent corporation was in the advanced stages of a massive acquisition deal. A massive European industrial conglomerate was looking to buy our entire division. The tentative valuation of the deal was staggering, $435 million. Everyone at the management level knew it was happening, but nobody spoke about it on the record. The atmosphere in the administrative buildings was tense. People walked softly, spoke in hushed tones, and desperately tried to look indispensable. When $435 million is on the table, executives get nervous, and mid-level managers get fired. Bradley immediately began doing what external efficiency experts always do. He initiated a process he cheerfully referred to as organizational right-sizing. He spent his first 3 weeks walking through the administrative wings, always accompanied by a silent assistant holding a tablet, calling department heads into brief, interrogatory meetings to justify their headcount and their budget. When it was my department's turn, Bradley requested a meeting in my office. My office was not a plush executive suite. It was a functional, slightly cramped room located near the main control center. It had one narrow window overlooking a cooling tower, 3 walls lined floor to ceiling with heavy 3-ring binders, and shelves groaning under the weight of engineering reference manuals dating back to the 1990s. Bradley sat across from my cluttered desk, looking distinctly out of place in his tailored suit amidst the hard hats and calibration equipment. He looked at me, then at the organizational chart on his tablet, noting my team of 4. He smiled a tight, practiced smile and asked me to explain, in simple business terms, what exactly my department produced. What was our tangible output? What was our return on investment? I stared at him for a long moment. I explained that we did not produce a product. We produced safety. We ensured that the facility did not explode. We ensured that the company did not face massive federal fines and that our operational licenses were not revoked. I explained the federal regulations, the Environmental Protection Agency mandates, and the occupational safety requirements. Bradley listened, nodding slowly. He jotted down a few notes on his tablet. He thanked me for my time and left. I knew exactly what that meant. He had not understood a single word of the technical reality, but he had understood the budget numbers perfectly. 2 weeks later, Bradley summoned me to his pristine office in the main administrative building. He informed me, using a lot of corporate jargon, that he was going to consolidate my department's administrative and record-keeping functions into the general operations management pool. Consequently, my 3 highly trained safety engineers were going to be reassigned to other facilities or, more likely, offered severance packages. I, given my tenure, would remain as a single-point resource to oversee the transition. He framed this catastrophic dismantling of a critical safety team as a streamlining initiative. He confidently assured me that the complex regulatory functions I had described could be easily distributed across existing management competencies. I leaned forward in my chair, struggling to keep my voice level. I asked him if he fully comprehended the legal and operational implications of a management of change document. He offered a vague, dismissive wave of his hand and claimed he had a solid, conceptual understanding. I pressed further. I asked him if he understood the federal penalties and the physical risks associated with restarting a high-pressure processing unit without a completed, legally binding pre-startup safety review. Bradley's smile vanished. He adopted a tone of patronizing patience. He told me that he appreciated my historical perspective, but that change was often difficult for individuals who had been entrenched in one specific role for too long. He suggested I was being overly dramatic and protective of my fiefdom. I stood up. I thanked him for his time. I walked out of his office knowing that the countdown had just started. By the end of September, my 3 engineers were gone. One had been with me for 14 years, another for 9, and the youngest for 5. I was left sitting alone at my desk, bearing the entire process safety management burden for an 800-acre chemical facility. I ran the numbers. The cost savings were absurdly small in the grand scheme. Bradley had saved the company roughly $132,000 annually in salaries and associated benefits. What he had simultaneously done to Vanguard Chemicals' risk, exposure, regulatory compliance status, and legal liability was immeasurable. I did not panic. I am an engineer. My default response to chaos is methodical documentation. For the next 3 weeks, I did not plan a dramatic exit or plot revenge. I simply documented reality. I cataloged every single open inspection item. I tracked down every overdue structural certification. I compiled a list of every management of change protocol that had been initiated by operations but never formally closed out by a qualified safety engineer. I listed every pre-startup safety review that was mandated for the massive facility turnaround scheduled for the upcoming spring. I compiled all of this devastating data into a massive, meticulously organized transition binder. It was a masterpiece of regulatory compliance, complete with cross-references, federal statute citations, and color-coded risk assessments. It was the kind of document that assumed the person reading it actually possessed the technical expertise to understand the impending doom it described. I placed the thick binder squarely on the corner of my desk, exactly where anyone walking in would see it. Nobody ever came to ask about it. Bradley was too busy presenting his quarterly savings reports to the executive board. On a crisp Tuesday morning in late October, I drafted my formal letter of resignation. I did not write an emotional manifesto. I kept it brief, professional, and legally precise. I provided the standard 30 days of notice required by my contract. I did not send a dramatic company-wide farewell email. I declined the exit interview offered by the Human Resources Department, citing a lack of availability. I submitted the letter directly to the plant manager, who immediately forwarded it to Bradley, who then, I assume, alerted the executive team. Later that afternoon, the plant manager called me into his office. He looked stressed. He told me that my departure timing was highly inconvenient, given the impending fourth quarter audits. I maintained a neutral expression. I acknowledged his concern. I stated that I understood the situation was challenging, which is precisely why I had prepared a comprehensive, highly detailed transition document outlining every critical compliance vulnerability and upcoming regulatory deadline. I told him it was ready for whoever would be assuming my comprehensive responsibilities. The plant manager rubbed his temples and asked when exactly that replacement person would be identified and onboarded. I looked at him calmly. I suggested that workforce planning and talent acquisition were entirely within Bradley's area of responsibility, as per his recent restructuring initiative. There was a long, heavy silence in the room. The plant manager sighed deeply and said he would pass my comments along to corporate. I worked my final 30 days with absolute precision. I did not slack off. I completed every single safety assessment I had initiated. I formally closed out every regulatory item that was legally permissible for me to close. For the items that required ongoing monitoring or future action, I sent heavily documented emails. I flagged specific compliance deadlines, quoting the exact federal environmental and occupational safety codes, highlighting the items that required urgent attention within 30, 60, and 90 days. I made sure to carbon copy the plant manager, Bradley, and the corporate legal department on every single one of those emails. I continuously updated the master transition binder until it reflected the exact state of the facility up to my very last hour of employment. I left it sitting there, prominent and ignored on the corner of my desk. On my final Friday afternoon, I packed a small cardboard box with my personal items, a few framed photographs, my vintage slide rule, and a favorite coffee mug. I walked out to my truck, the same truck I had been sitting in when this entire mess began. I drove out of the main gates. I stopped at a convenience store down the highway, bought a cold bottle of sparkling water and a bag of roasted peanuts. I pulled over onto the shoulder of the highway, facing the sprawling expanse of the Vanguard Chemical facility. I sat on the tailgate of my truck for a long time, watching the massive cooling towers vent steam and the flare stacks burn off excess gases. The facility was a beast that never slept, a complex organism of steel, heat, and pressure that required constant, vigilant care. It looked steady and indifferent, but I knew the invisible fractures that were already beginning to spread through its administrative foundation. Then, I got back in my truck and drove home. That Saturday, my daughter hosted her birthday dinner. We went to a fantastic, slightly loud seafood restaurant overlooking the bay. Her husband, as predicted, ordered an absurd amount of grilled snapper, oysters, and shrimp. We ate, laughed, and ended up taking 3 large boxes of leftovers home. During the drive back to my house, Emily turned to me from the passenger seat. She asked me what my plans were now that I was officially retired. I smiled and told her I had a few options, mostly involving a long list of deferred maintenance projects around the house. She laughed and said she sincerely hoped that at least one of those options involved sleeping past 5:30 in the morning. I chuckled and told her I would see what I could do about retraining my internal clock. For the next 6 weeks, my life was blissfully quiet. I rebuilt the wooden deck in my backyard, a project I had been putting off for 3 years. I read 4 thick historical biographies. I took a week-long road trip through the mountains with my wife, staying in small cabins and ignoring our phones. It was the first time in nearly 3 decades that we had traveled without my having to constantly check my email for emergency shutdown notifications. One evening, while we were sitting on the porch, my wife looked at me and remarked that I seemed fundamentally different. I asked her what she meant. She thought for a moment and said that I finally seemed entirely present in the moment, rather than mentally calculating pressure loads somewhere else. I thought about that precisely. She was right. Meanwhile, back in the corporate world, the $435 million acquisition was reaching its critical final stages. The potential buyer, a massive, highly disciplined German industrial conglomerate, sent their elite due diligence team to the corporate headquarters in late November. This was not a cursory review. The German team included forensic financial analysts, aggressive corporate legal counsel, and 3 senior engineers from their global regulatory compliance division. The lead compliance engineer was a man named Heinrich. Heinrich had been conducting exhaustive industrial safety audits across Europe and Asia for over 30 years. By all accounts from my former colleagues, Heinrich was terrifyingly methodical, humorless, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of international safety regulations. He was exactly the kind of auditor you do not want looking at your books if you have been cutting corners. I learned the spectacular details of what transpired from my former plant manager, who called me on a brisk Tuesday morning in early December. He sounded exhausted. He started the conversation by awkwardly asking how I was enjoying my retirement. I told him I was enjoying it immensely. He cleared his throat and asked if, hypothetically, I had any availability for some short-term, highly compensated consulting work. I leaned back in my chair and said I was always open to interesting conversations. Then he poured out the whole story. The German due diligence team had demanded unrestricted access to Vanguard's regulatory compliance documentation. Heinrich had immediately zeroed in on the process safety management files. What he found what he did not find was catastrophic. Heinrich discovered 23 open, critical inspection items that were significantly past their federally mandated completion dates. He unearthed 9 complex management of change records that had been initiated by the operations team, implemented in the physical plant, but never formally reviewed, approved, and closed out by a certified safety engineer. This meant the facility was running altered chemical processes without any verified safety parameters. Furthermore, Heinrich found 4 major pre-startup safety reviews that had been completed and physically signed off on. However, the signatures belonged to operations managers, who held absolutely no federal certification or legal authority to approve those documents under the Environmental Protection Agency's Risk Management Plan guidelines. To an auditor like Heinrich, an unauthorized signature on a federal safety document was not a clerical error. It was evidence of systemic negligence. Finally, Heinrich noted a glaring chronological anomaly. He found my name and signature on literally thousands of critical compliance documents, certifications, hazard analyses, and safety reviews spanning nearly 3 decades. And then, abruptly, my name vanished from all documentation dated after October. During the massive, high-stakes presentation meeting where Heinrich delivered his findings to the Vanguard Executive Board and the German acquisition representatives, he reportedly did not yell or act dramatic. He simply placed his thick binder of findings on the polished mahogany conference table. The heavy thud echoed in the silent room. Heinrich looked directly at the Vanguard chief executive officer and asked a single devastating question. He wanted to know exactly who I was and why I was no longer employed there. The room fell dead silent. The CEO, a man who had relied on my quarterly safety briefings for years to keep the board happy, slowly turned his gaze toward Bradley. Bradley, sweating visibly, attempted to deploy his corporate buzzwords. He explained that my departure was the result of a strategic organizational restructuring aimed at maximizing operational synergies. Heinrich stared at him blankly. He asked Bradley to explain exactly what those synergies were, specifically in the context of the 9 illegal, unclosed management of change records operating in a live chemical environment. Bradley stammered. He said he would need his team to dig into the granular specifics of those files. Heinrich then asked about the 4 pre-startup safety reviews signed by unqualified personnel, pointing out that this was a direct violation of federal law. Bradley nervously claimed that those specific approvals had been managed through an alternative, streamlined internal process. Heinrich did not miss a beat. He asked to see the documentation for this alternative process and the federal variants allowing it. Bradley swallowed hard and admitted he would have to follow up on that request. Heinrich slowly closed his binder. He stood up, speaking with the cold, absolute authority of a man who held a $435 million check in his hand. Heinrich announced his conclusion. He informed the room that his firm could not, under any circumstances, recommend proceeding with the acquisition of an industrial facility that harbored 23 overdue federal inspections, 9 illegal operational changes, and 4 fraudulent safety reviews. He highlighted the profound absurdity of a company that had deliberately terminated its sole, highly experienced process safety expert just weeks before the most critical regulatory audit in the company's history. Heinrich delivered the verdict calmly. The massive acquisition deal was officially suspended indefinitely, pending a comprehensive, independent regulatory remediation audit. The plant manager called me from his car in the parking garage immediately after that meeting concluded. He talked rapidly for about 5 minutes, detailing the panic that had engulfed the executive floor. I let him talk until he ran out of breath. Then I asked him the only question that mattered. I asked him what exactly corporate wanted from me. He told me the executive board was begging me to return immediately in a senior consulting capacity to take total control of the remediation process. I asked about the German firm's timeline. He said Heinrich Koss's team had given Vanguard exactly 90 days to demonstrate massive, verifiable progress in compliance, or they would permanently withdraw their acquisition offer and walk away. I told the plant manager to have legal send me the complete list of Heinrich's audit findings and the exact scope of the required remediation. The encrypted file arrived in my inbox 2 hours later. I spent the afternoon reviewing it. The situation was dire, but for someone with my specific background, it was entirely fixable. I knew the history of every single valve, pipeline, and pressure vessel listed in those documents. I knew the maintenance schedules. I knew which specialized contractors possessed the required federal certifications to perform the overdue inspections. For any outside consultant, untangling that mess would have taken 6 months just to understand the baseline. For me, it was simply a matter of executing the work I had been doing for 28 years. That evening, I drafted my consulting proposal. I did not hold back. I set my daily consulting rate at precisely 3 times what I had been earning as a fully burdened salaried employee. I demanded a guaranteed minimum contract length of 4 months, paid regardless of early completion. I explicitly outlined the scope of my authority, including a non-negotiable clause stating that I retain the absolute, unilateral right to halt any plant operation I deemed unsafe, and the right to refuse to sign any compliance document that did not meet my personal standards. I was not going to risk my professional license or my reputation to cover up Bradley's incompetence. I emailed the proposal to the CEO's direct assistant at 8 o'clock the next morning. They signed it, without a single requested revision, before noon. I drove back to the Vanguard chemical facility on a cold, overcast Wednesday morning. The sprawling complex looked exactly the same. The massive flare stacks were still burning. I parked in the visitor lot, walked into the main lobby, and received a temporary contractor badge. I walked down the familiar hallway to my old office. It had been hastily converted into a makeshift storage room for surplus office chairs and marketing materials. I pushed a stack of boxes aside. My transition binder was still sitting on the corner of the desk, covered in a thin layer of dust. Nobody had ever opened it. I wiped the dust off the cover, sat down in my old chair, and got to work. The work was intense, but deeply familiar. I systematically attacked the compliance backlog. I tracked down the unauthorized management of change records, forced operations to shut down the affected units, conducted the proper engineering reviews, and formally closed the loops. I called in the specialized contractors I had trusted for decades, Euros men, who answered the phone when they saw my number, Euros, and scheduled the 23 overdue federal inspections in a relentless, overlapping sequence. I personally reviewed and reauthorized the 4 botched pre-startup safety reviews, ensuring every physical parameter met federal code before filing the amended paperwork with the Environmental Protection Agency. I painstakingly rebuilt the facility's preventative maintenance schedule, projecting it out for the next 24 months to ensure this failure cascaded no further. In early March, Heinrich and his German due diligence team returned for their final remediation review. I was the one leading the meetings. Heinrich and I spent 3 exhausting days locked in a conference room, going through the thousands of pages of remediation documentation line by painstaking line. We were both older men who understood the gravity of industrial safety. We spoke the same technical language. We respected each other's uncompromising standards. At the end of the 3rd day, Heinrich closed the final folder. He looked across the table at me, gave a short, crisp nod, and stated that the remediation had been executed to the highest international standards. He did not smile, but coming from him, it was high praise. The acquisition negotiations were officially reopened the following week. The deal finally closed in late May. The final purchase price was $450 million, slightly higher than the original estimate due to some updated asset valuations that had occurred during the extended delay. I read the official announcement in a financial newsletter. I was no longer at the facility when the champagne was popped. My 4-month consulting contract had concluded in April. I had completed the remediation, documented every single action, and successfully handed the program over to a newly hired, highly qualified 3-person process safety management team. This time, corporate had given the team the proper authority, direct reporting lines to the CEO, and a budget that accurately reflected the massive liability they managed. On my final day as a consultant, I left a brand new, vastly expanded transition binder on the desk of the new lead engineer. It was updated through that very morning. I learned the ultimate fate of Bradley a few weeks later. The German conglomerate, upon finalizing the acquisition, immediately cleaned house. Bradley was unceremoniously terminated, but the corporate fallout did not end there. Vanguard's original shareholders, infuriated by the near collapse of a massive payday, initiated a devastating lawsuit against Bradley. They formally accused him of a gross breach of fiduciary duty. The lawsuit alleged that his reckless, uninformed cost-cutting measures had intentionally jeopardized the company's core assets, directly causing the initial failure of the acquisition and incurring millions in unnecessary remediation costs. From what I heard, his promising executive career in heavy industry was permanently destroyed. That evening, I drove out to a high bridge overlooking the industrial shipping channel. I parked my truck and leaned against the railing, watching the massive tankers navigate the waterway. The refineries and chemical plants stretched out to the horizon, a sea of lights and steady flames against the dark sky. My phone buzzed. It was Emily. She asked how my absolute final last day had gone. I told her it had gone perfectly. She asked what I was going to do now. I mentioned that I had received phone calls from a refinery down in Louisiana. a massive chemical storage terminal near Corpus Christi, and an international firm that specialized in forensic safety audits for insurance companies. They were all offering obscene amounts of money for my consulting services. Emily laughed loudly through the phone. She told me it sounded like my plans to sleep in were permanently canceled. I agreed that they probably were. She told me that her husband had said something interesting at dinner. He had said that a man with my level of expertise isn't the kind of employee a company can replace. He is simply the kind of employee a company temporarily misplaces until they realize how much they need him. I smiled in the dark. It was a good line. I watched the flare stacks burn. A man who knows exactly why a specific high-pressure valve was installed 20 years ago, who remembers the structural integrity tests from a decade past, and who understands the devastating mathematics of a chemical chain reaction euros. That man does not become obsolete just because a spreadsheet says his salary is an expense. His expertise simply becomes necessary again, usually under desperate circumstances. The only variable in the equation is the ultimate cost of the lesson the company has to learn. In Vanguard Biochemicalu's case, the final tally for their lesson was staggering. The delay in the acquisition cost them roughly $52 million in lost market momentum, massive legal fees, emergency contractor premiums, and my exorbitant consulting invoices. All of that just to save $132,000. I shook my head, got back into my truck, and drove home. The mathematics of corporate arrogance will never stop being remarkable to me.